Sorry for the technical difficulties, but I'll go ahead and also begin. I'm really excited to come talk to you all today. My name is Khadija. I'm a senior in the college. I study Justice and Peace Studies, and I was lucky enough to be a Lisa J. Rain Scholar this summer, and I did a summer fellowship. So I just want to extend my gratitude to GOFAR and to Andrea Whistler, who was my research advisor. She's the best. So, anyways. As a JUPS major, I went to Cape Town, South Africa in June of 2015 to study post-apartheid conflict resolution. And while I was there, the largest student movement since the 1976 Soweto shootings broke out in October. And so I decided to stay the duration of my junior year and conduct a project over the summer. And my research focuses specifically on two universities in the Western Cape. I really wish I had my presentation to show you right now. But anyways, so Rhodes Must Fall was a South African student movement that started in March of 2015 after a rise of decolonization conversations on campus. It's been 21 years since apartheid ended, and things are still really messed up. Still a lot of racism, still a lot of structural violence. And so students at UCT were calling attention to this, particularly because the University of Cape Town is a historically white institution, and it was a whites-only institution under apartheid. And so things are still really, really intense, and so the mission of Rhodes Must Fall was to call attention to the violent symbolism of a Cecil John Rhodes statue that sat out on the top of campus and looked out over the entire city of Cape Town. Its goal was to talk about decolonization of the university and bring the physical structure of the statue down. And yes, the statue came down in April. But things didn't end there. A wave of consciousness rising continued afterwards, and this is where conversations on intersectionality were born. And I forgot to mention that the title of my presentation is Intersections of Student Activism, Black Queer Women's Imagination, and the South African 2015-2016 protests. Okay, yay, here we go. All right. Okay, so this is my project. I'm Khadija, Lisa J. Rain Scholar. You all get that. Okay, so, all right. Now you get the idea. It was a really big deal. So Rhodes Must Fall, huge protests that started in March. Statue came down in April. Things continued, and there's a lot of consciousness raising. And then what happened in October is the Minister of Education announced a 12% tuition increase, which would essentially directly kick out poor Black first-generation students. And how can you expect anything to change in a post-apartheid conflict society if you're not going to let those who can change it into the classroom? So basically, the announcement came out on a Sunday, and on Monday morning, students dropped everything, and people started protesting, because otherwise, they wouldn't have been able to come back in December. And so throughout the week, things got really, really big. This is a video that I don't think I have time to show you, but yeah. So a lot of energy. I wish I had more time to show you that, I'm sorry, but so that's kind of the vibe of it. And on Friday, after a huge wave of protests, the President Zuma finally announced that there'd be a 0% increase. But still, things didn't stop there. And this is because the Freedom Charter that ended apartheid guaranteed the right to free education for all South Africans, and that right has not been realized. So after a year of studying at the historically Black University, University of the Western Cape, and learning about the country's history of protest, I really realized how revolutionary the Fees Must Fall protests really were in terms of South Africa's struggle history. Like a widely used term in the Justice and Peace Studies field is Black feminism's theory of intersectionality and the matrix of domination, which shows how Black, queer, transgender, poor women are the most marginalized in society. And in the 2015-2016 protests, it was mostly Black, poor, queer, transgender women who were leading these protests. And they held power, they called attention to their power, and they called attention to their complete erasure in South African struggle history. You know, we know about Nelson Mandela, we know about Steve Biko, but we don't know the names of other activists who have been doing the same work. And unfortunately, most of the articles and academic writings that are coming out about Fees Must Fall today still follow that patriarchal narrative and write out the reality of who is involved in this movement. So don't be mistaken though, South Africa is still a very violent and unsafe place for activists to be women and for activists to be queer. High levels of violence against women, unfortunately corrective rape, and homophobic violence are very intense realities for women in this country, and so that is why this is so overwhelmingly moving, the power that they held in these spaces. And this is Masse, and I really love this photo. So the three pillars of Rhodes Must Fall, Fees Must Fall were Pan-Africanism, Black consciousness, and Black feminism. And as my time there went on, I was continuing to be involved in the protest, but in April there were students that were permanently expelled from the university, and so in order to produce ethical and relevant research, I really had to rearrange and refocus what I was going to be doing my research on, and that made me turn towards the internal dynamics of the movement. So my research questions. Decolonization of academia and knowledge production were a core project of this movement. Also, I have to produce what I want to see in the field. So my project centered those at the furthest margin, Black queer women, at the center of investigation. But it was not anything where we're treating Black queer women as a specimen of study, but rather situating their experience as a locus from which all other social, political, and economic knowledge could be produced, kind of like as a methodological rejection of male-centrism and a contribution to radical restructuring of social movement research. So my first question was, what was their experience of these protests? Secondly, when trying to produce decolonized knowledge, what tools and practices aren't tainted by colonialism in a society whose formal academia has been colonized since the 1400s? That was a big question. So what arose in working through this was that imagination could act as a force of resistance, and that we can reject typical formal methods of research and accept imagination as a legitimate tool for knowledge production. So what was their positive imagination of a socially just intersectional movement? What could that look like? And lastly, what is this gap? Because there was a gap between imagination and reality. And what does that tell us about the current state of post-apartheid South Africa? And what does it mean for the radical potential of Black queer women in South Africa? All right. But, okay, so I'm an American, I'm Western educated. What does that mean? How does this play into the decolonial project? And this is what my methodology really focused on, which Andrea Whistler is nodding right now because I was like really intense with my methodology because I really did want to re-entrench the power dynamics that really frustrate me in the research realm. So what does it mean that I'm an American? How does that fit into the decolonial paradigm, and who am I doing this for? There's a lot of different things that I was paying attention to, but it was honestly really obnoxious that there were a lot of Westerners and Europeans that came to South Africa over the past year and constructed entire careers off of writing about Rhodes Must Fall and these students' pain. And how do I not do that? So also what I found is that I learned just as much about American imperialism and imperial education as I did about South Africa and decolonization through reflecting on my own framework of thinking, and I think this is important. So what did this look like? This looked like me being actively engaged with the movement over the 14 months as I was being there and establishing important, delicate relationships. Being a familiar face, I was there on the ground and doing things and offering myself in a way that others might not have the capacity to do so. But all while actively acknowledging that I had the most intense privilege, that being to leave the country and disengage with these all-consuming issues. So what could I do with that? There were a lot of things that were done, but one of the things I wanted to do most was bring people together. And so that is what I did for my research. I was a student at the University of the Western Cape, and during my time there and during these protests, I could visibly see the disconnect between the two universities and the two campuses. I would be at UWC for the day and experience way more intense levels of violence and media blackout, and then go to UCT after school and go to their nightly plenaries, and people would be like, oh, what happened at school today at other schools? And 30 minutes into the township, students were being shot with rubber bullets and tear gassed in their dorm rooms. So this is a huge commentary on the blatant lack of solidarity between the two campuses, and I thought that was a problem. So along with building relationships, this looked like a formalish sort of research, a formalish focus group that I conducted over the summer. And these are some of the themes that emerged in the focus group. But really what was important to me was that this was the first time that a lot of these activists came together in a physical space. So themes that emerged were the university as a violent space, making students hyper-aware of their identities. A lot of the times we heard things about a selfish motive of liberation for being involved. There was really intense oppression that existed within these activist spaces. And what is actually pretty interesting is that there was enough power and momentum behind the Black queer faction of this movement that they could actually make themselves be a faction and divide the movement in a type of way. So these are some quotes that I hope you have the time to read through a bit. And yeah, you can really hear the intensity of what was going on here. But what I want to just talk about quickly is that when we were thinking about intersectionality and we were thinking about imagination, people were really stuck, in imagining what that could look like and imagining how these things could really function and come into reality. especially in an exclusively South African context that takes into account the legacies of apartheid, colonialism, and the newly post-conflict state. We focus a lot on Black feminists and Black theorists in there, but like Lamisa's quote right here, she says, theory wasn't really written for us in terms of Black South African movement. And so then what would this look like? And I think that's exactly what we're witness to in this movement and examining these dynamics, is that we're witness to this search for intersectional action that is sculpting a new South African history, what Black queer women's voices and actions were creating in these protests, and I believe that's what we're witness to. So lastly, these are just some photos of some things that came from the focus group. That's Lynn Dewey at the top with just a really powerful photo. And what happened afterwards was people who were involved in the focus group, we worked on creating a pamphlet for free education. And there's some students who were in the focus group at the bottom photo there. And really what this project was about was letting it just be known for the history books that this revolution has women, gays, queers, and trans. Remember that. So yeah, thank you. I also just want to add quickly, there's a blue piece of paper on your desk right now, and in line with my methodology, I'm going to try and scam you all. Just kidding, I'm not going to scam you, but part of my methodology is that I want to continue spreading this knowledge, and on those pieces of paper there are links to further readings that are written by some of the women that were involved in the focus group. I'd really encourage you to read and learn more about it. And additionally, it's $1 to 16 Rand right now, and these students are being financially excluded from the university. So there's 2 bank accounts at the bottom there. One of them is to donate to the pamphlets for free education that we're working on, that students are trying to pass out to build capacity building in the greater South African context. And also the other one is called Twerk Fest, which is done by these Black queer women who are in the focus group to raise money for academically excluded people. All right, thank you.